There are a lot of people who think that the Chauvin verdict represents the beginning of the work that needs to be done to achieve police reform. And there's pressure for the Senate to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Today, the Attorney General announced a broad probe into the Minneapolis Police Department.
Today, I am announcing that the Justice Department has opened a civil investigation to determine whether the Minneapolis Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing.
Rashawn Ray is a sociology professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's also a governance study fellow at the Brookings Institution. And also Philip Stinson is with us, a criminal justice professor at Bowling Green State University and the author of Criminology Explains Police Violence. He's a former police officer and has done extensive research on police misconduct. Thank you both for being here. And Philip, let me start with you. You compiled the data on police violence, police crime as well. Your reaction to that announcement from the Attorney General that there will be this investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department?
Well, I think it's appropriate, a patterns and practice investigation to look into whether the Minneapolis Police Department engage in patterns and practices of unconstitutional policing is appropriate. It will likely end in an investigation report and the entering of a consent decree or an agreement with the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department with the Justice Department, where an independent monitor would be appointed for a period of years, at least 5 years, conducting regular, periodic, and ongoing audits. This is a good thing, actually, because with that process, we'll bring federal resources to the Minneapolis Police Department. They'll be able to provide resources for training, changing policies to mirror best practices in policing. So overall, it's a good thing. We need to see what the investigation determines in terms of issuing a report, and that will dictate where it goes from there in terms of a consent decree.
All right, Rashawn, you have a new piece published today, actually, just the last few hours, which from my reading, moderates the narrative that the Chauvin conviction is transformative in some way, that this is a new day, one man, one case. Do you believe some are overstating the implications of this conviction?
I think it could be. I mean, one of the things we know is that rarely are police officers convicted, rarely are they even charged. Every year, over 1,000 people are killed by law enforcement. And part of what happens is in the courts oftentimes over-individualizes the bad apple narrative. And instead, as I've written about, bad apples oftentimes come from rotten trees. And those rotten trees also can poison the good apples. Good apples don't simply supersede bad apples. Instead, what happens, they get swallowed up. And so part of what we have to focus on, what people want, is systemic change. And one case is not going to do that, particularly a case where it was a slam dunk. Look, everyone saw the ball go in the net, but everyone looked at the scoreboard to see if it was going to count, because people know, as you all just highlighted, as the verdict was being read, there was another teenager in Ohio that was being killed by police. And what people want is broader systemic changes, not simply just individual officers being held accountable.
Let's talk about that broader change, Philip. I participated in a special on CNN about fear in communities of color. And what I've said since is that we need to talk about the fear of communities of color. And you've written that what needs to be addressed, and I want to use your words here, is the core of the subculture in policing of fear of black men and boys. Talk more about that.
Well, it's also a fear of black women and black girls. Many police officers exhibit a fear of black people. That's just a reality. I'm not suggesting that all police officers are racist, but until we figure out a way to deal with that core element of the culture of policing, or as I call it, the police subculture, at the more than 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies across the United States, I worry that we're not going to be able to implement meaningful reforms because, as they say, culture eats policy. We've got to change the culture of policing. We've got to change the way that officers think, the way that they interact with people of color, and we've got to change the way that police officers behave.
Rashawn, after the recent killings in Minnesota, the lieutenant governor there, Peggy Flanagan, tweeted that, quote, Minnesota is a place where it's not safe to be black. And she talked about it in the context of policing. But you wrote for Brookings about the health disparities in black and brown communities that are heavily policed, higher rates of blood pressure, higher levels of diabetes, higher rates of anxiety disorders. Is there a correlation between heavy policing and these health disparities?
Without a doubt. So what some of my colleagues and I aim to do was to examine neighborhoods that are over-policed, controlling for everything under the sun. And what we found is that men's mental health suffers, more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety. Women's physical health suffers, more likely to have higher blood pressures, more likely to be diabetics, more likely to be obese. And this is because we are continuously witnessing black pain and trauma in a way that people don't fully want to acknowledge. The people who witnessed George Floyd die and all the other people who watched it on video will never be the same again. We heard that from Rodney King's daughter about her and him. So part of what we have to look at is, as you talk about this being exhausting, that exhaustion actually manifests in health disparities that leads to black people dying a slow death, in spite of the fact that black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when we're not attacking or have a weapon. That the fact that it doesn't matter if you have a PhD or you're an anchor on CNN, that once you go down the street, you could end up like some of these people we're talking about.
Professor Rashawn Ray, Professor Philip Stinson, thank you both.
Thank you.
Next.